Good morning. It is Friday, the 24th of February. And today we look at Deuteronomy 7, verses 12 to 16, and Titus chapter 2, verses 1 to 15. That's all of Titus chapter 2. Again, and as following on from the message that we have been looking at for the last few weeks from the Old Testament, Isaiah, in a sense, a similar theme continuing now in Deuteronomy, and of course picking up the parallel in Paul's letter to Titus. And always the writer of Deuteronomy, one takes it as being Moses, is exhorting the people to remain constantly faithful to God, constantly aware that they can be all too easily distracted. And the same is true in Titus. Paul here is not simply saying, remain obedient to God, but he's giving specific instructions on how one should live. And so I, again, encourage you, challenge you to read Titus chapter 2. It's the whole letter of Titus is very short, so perhaps as your weekend reading, read the whole of chapter 2, whole of Titus, because by the time we pick up again our little talks next week, we will have moved on to another letter in the New Testament. But this refrain that I have picked up on of remaining constantly aware and focused on some form of right living, Paul giving specific examples, Moses in Deuteronomy simply saying remain obedient to God, never forget all that he has done for you, reminds me, and forgive me for talking about myself, but for me it is a powerful analogy, and I share it with you. In my younger years, when I was still living in Durban, I was a member of the National Sea Rescue Institute in Durban, Station 5. And one night we were called out. Distress flares had been seen off the coast of the Bluff. It was wasn't a stormy night, but the waves were super huge. And not knowing what had sent up the distress flares or where they were, trying to calculate from the current, were they being pushed further down the coast? That was our assumption. So we set off and went around the bluff, and we were faced with these incredibly large waves, and we couldn't get too close inshore. This is a bit of the background story, just to whet your appetite, as it were, and excuse the pun. We couldn't get too close inshore because the waves were so big they would swamp the boat, and we would then have to be rescued. So we slowly sailed just down behind the back line, which meant that we experienced the swells, but at least before they were breaking. And it's that breaking swell which is incredibly dangerous for a boat. And we sailed all the way down quite far, and then came back up again, looking for any further flares, looking out in this dark. It was pitch black at night, and we could see nothing. We would occasionally let off our own flares to give us light to see, and nothing. And we all took turns at the helm of the boat. And it became quite apparent to me that piloting a boat is much, it looks a lot easier than it really is. One has to be absolutely focused on your landmarks, but this is pitch black at night. There were no landlights, points on the land that we could see. We could only monitor the stars, and interestingly, it was the time of Halley's Comet, and so we had this incredible view of Halley's Comet, and you couldn't quite focus on that either because it was moving, so you had to focus on things that were not moving, and of course the compass, and the wind and the waves were constantly buffering the boat and pushing us off course. And you couldn't just allow yourself to get off course and then reposition yourself onto the bearing that we were meant to be following, because you were now approaching it from a different direction, and we knew there was that large offshore oil mooring platform, and we did not want to go sailing into that. And so one had to be absolutely focused on your task of piloting the boat at the helm and making sure that you were staying on bearing. And the moment it began to waver, you had to make corrective action. And it took me a while to learn how to do that. But here's the analogy. I think that life buffers us like the wind and the waves, constantly pushing and pulling us in different directions. And we cannot simply believe that if we permit during the week to just do whatever we want, and then on a Sunday, then to somehow reorientate our life. It may be too late. You get knocked off course, you use Sunday to reorientate yourself, but you're now approaching your bearing from a different direction, and you may well sail into that big offshore mooring buoy or some other rocks, or find yourself just a little too close to the shore, and you now have the waves breaking over you, and the risk for disaster is very, very real. So constant attention. And for me, the Christian life is very much like that. I don't mean to be melodramatic, but we do need to have this constant attention. And in the early years, maybe we do need to really focus quite hard on it, trusting that in the later years we begin to develop patterns and routines that allow us to almost predict how the wind and the waves will, if I go back to my analogy of the boat, will knock us off course. And so you begin to correct your course before the wave pushes you off of course. And so you're able to retain your course a lot more easily. So a simple analogy, but for me a very powerful one, and one that I've always remembered and I always try and follow. And so I encourage you, for the same reasons, to just be constantly aware. Now, of course, and let me end on this, to be able to pre-predict, I don't think that's the right word, but I'm stressing that one must act in advance. How and what could pull you, of course, is to then not get into such a situation. And, of course, to read your Bible constantly, to have a quiet time with God where you pray to God. And remember that prayer, this wonderful and simple analogy, but a powerful one. We have one mouth and two ears, so let's spend twice as much listening to God as we do talking to God, because often our talking to God is us telling God, demanding. God's not an automatic prayer answering machine. He is God, and we are his fallen children, and he wants us to come back to him and to be righteous. So folks, develop that sense of constant monitoring of your life and of being obedient to God. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll chat again next week. God bless.